I'm Dr. Ayla Lepine. I'm an art historian and an ordinand in the Church of England at Westcott House. And I'm here with Dr. Alison Gray, who is a biblical tutor at Westminster College. And we are in the Fitzwilliam Museum thinking about the relationship between art and the Old Testament. And here we have a painting from around the 1530s by Frans Francken, who is a Belgian artist. It was painted somewhere near Antwerp, and it's very typical of mid to early 16th century Belgian art. Very classical, lots of real sense of diversity of emotions, lots of revelry, and it's filled with gestures, with play, with joy. And one of the things that makes this painting fascinating is where your eye is drawn first. I don't know about you, but what I really see at first in this painting is that really quite deep and strong light coming from behind the mountain on the left and diffusing the whole painting with this sense of really sort of summery, late afternoon kind of
like
light.
A warm glow.
A warm glow. And this whole party feels like a warm glow of a party. What do you see?
My eye was drawn to these two women here for the same reason, that they're both very light and bright, and proportionally I think we see them more than the other characters. The others are slightly dimmer, aren't they? But I think almost every single woman in this painting is naked except for the ones dancing, and that's obviously where our eye is supposed to be drawn to, the sort of the symbol of precisely of revelry and of lewdness, and really playing on a motif that runs throughout the Bible of idolatry and adultery, and that sexual promiscuity and unfaithfulness is a symbol of Israel's treatment of the Lord.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said too for the sense of joy, but also the sense of real ambiguity in the play of gesture in these two figures, but in a number of different instances right the way across this painting. This artist really understands composition awfully well, because the way that he's using bodies, twisting and turning them, is really drawing our eye into the scene. So these figures are not only painted using this white, high-key palette with lots of warm yellows and bright white and cream tones, but also the way that her body is twisted out towards us, but also inward towards the painting, and in particular towards this very flirtatious wine-drinking couple just here, helps us to be able to really get involved in the sense of emotion and also in the sense of Bacchic joy of this scene. But the main figure, the main character in this scene, so far, in what our eye is drawn to, is nowhere to be found.
No.
Where is this person, and what is this person doing?
It is a little bit like Where's Wally?
It is a little bit.
We have to hunt for Moses in this story. So this depiction is of the worship of the golden calf, which again you don't see immediately, even though it's on a really, really high pole, pillar here. There's this calf at the top, but Moses is actually in this far corner, completely blended into the mountainside, isn't he? There are two figures to his right-hand side as well, to the left on the painting, and actually it's quite difficult to figure out who these characters are. We know that Joshua went up the mountain with Moses, and so whether this is Joshua with Aaron, perhaps Aaron has been left in charge of these people and is responsible for the golden calf, although when he's asked, he says that he put the gold into the fire and out came this calf, as if he had nothing to do with the fashioning of the idol, which is quite interesting.
That's passing the buck in quite a big way.
It is, but what's interesting that the painter seems to have done here is really picking up on in the biblical narrative. The people come to Aaron and they say, we want a God to worship, make us gods. And because they don't know what's happened to Moses, they actually don't know what's become of him in their minds.
So do they lose their way when they lose him, because he's their leader, when he is seen by them to have abandoned them?
Absolutely.
Then they are no longer interested in serving the Lord and wish to be self-serving because they've simply lost their way.
That's right. And actually in the painting, he is completely invisible to them. So that's very clever.
No one is looking at
no
him,
one
not
is looking
one
at him
of these
at all.
figures. They're looking at one another, they're making music together, they're dancing, they're having fun. And often what you get, particularly in art of this period, is one figure, often the figure of a child, who will be doing something slightly different. Everybody else is having a good time, and there will be this child whose eyes or whose gesture will say to the viewer, but this is the real story. This artist hasn't used that motif at all.
No.
We have to go hunting for it ourselves, and to be able to see aright what this story is trying to tell us, we have to look very carefully, in the same way that a text might be scrutinized very carefully in order to be able to understand how and why this community has gone astray in the way that it has.
Absolutely. So let's look a bit more closely at Moses here. What's another fascinating thing about Moses and about portrayals of Moses throughout the ages from quite an early period is that he has horns on his head, and you have to look quite closely to see the horns. So they are shining slightly and radiating with light.
Yeah, they're glowing a little bit, and they're one of the only things, as you start to look at the figure of Moses, that seem to create a kind of delineation of his figure against this large, rocky mountainside.
Yeah, but actually there's a translation quirk here, but also it's an anticipation of what comes in chapter 34. The horns represent Moses' skin shining, and in Hebrew the word for shining is karan. Now what's really interesting is that it's been interpreted in translation as keren, which is horn. And so
awkward.
And so rather than Moses' face shining, we get Moses' horns, and the horns we can see in Rome, Michelangelo's marble of Moses holding the Ten Commandments. He has these amazing twirly horns, which again is perhaps associated with the shining, but the symbolism is of having met with God.
And it's a classic motif. It's very difficult to find images of Moses in and around the Renaissance and much earlier as well, where the horns are not present, because it's this iconographic clue. It's a bit like St. Peter and his keys. If Moses has got some tablets and he's got some horns, then we know who that is, and we know where we stand. And unfortunately it all stands on an awkward mistranslation.
But even here it's happening too early as well, because he hasn't had this further conversation with God, which happens in chapter 34 when he comes down the mountain, and the people are then afraid to look at him. Now it's interesting here that hasn't yet happened, but he has got the horn so that we can identify him, presumably. And he smashed the tablets down in his anger. Now he has just bargained with God, wrestled with God to spare these people. And now as he's coming down the mountain and he's seen the full extent of their rebellion, is when he gets very, very angry and then smashes these tablets. And they are sort of scattered there on the mountain, aren't they?
I think there's something quite extraordinary that the artist has done here between the strong, craggy, natural force of the mountain from which Moses has just descended with these two figures next to him, and the sense of brittleness, the almost inconsequential man-made quality of these tablets split into disintegrating. They're grey, they're uninteresting, they're abandoned on this hillside. They are the exact opposite of the kind of visual interest that the artist has created with these women in the foreground. Quite frankly, that roast chicken to the eye and the grapes, luscious and ripe beside it, are far more visually compelling than
the tablets
stone
of
tablets
stone
with the commandments on them. So there's a real sense of theological contrast and theological sensitivity that this artist has managed to employ here.
It's interesting with the calf on this pillar. It says that Aaron built an altar in front of the calf, and that isn't there, but it's using this the symbol of a maypole that they're using and dancing around it like a maypole, which is quite fun. That is a sort of one of the areas of the paintings that your eye is drawn to, isn't it?
Well, it's an emblem of the revelry associated with the classical pagan world, and I think we can really see that in the feasting here as well, where this is a celebration in which there is actually nothing to celebrate, and where there is far too much of everything. So all of this becomes a kind of allegory in its own right for excess. That's not to say that a biblical interpretation of this, either in the painter's time or in ours, should pit joy and pleasure against following God's law, but it's simply that this is the wrong joy at the wrong time and in the wrong way. So there is a sense of erotic pleasure, there is a sense of aural pleasure with these musicians here. There's lots to anticipate and lots to enjoy even looking at this really sumptuous food. And one of the things then that the artist is pointing us towards, and he's part of a major tradition surrounding this in his time and place and in others, is that it is right to enjoy the good things of creation, but it is not right to overindulge in the good things of creation, because everything sort of fades away unless it is directed towards the right worship and the glorification of God. So it's really in the vast gulf between the beauty and the enticing allure of the bodies, the food, and indeed the calf itself, which becomes the epicenter of this whirling dance. And the ultimate truth, as far as biblical revelation is concerned, of what it really is all about. And what it really is all about is Moses working awfully hard on behalf of these people who have ultimately abandoned him and abandoned God because they thought that he had abandoned them. So all of this is a kind of tragic misunderstanding in a way, and that deep sense of tragedy is both minimized in terms of scale for the artist here and in the almost inconsequential placement of these abandoned stone tablets, and it's also maximized because the first thing we look at is a joyful party, and then the more we investigate and the more our eye travels around the subtleties of this painting, not at the center but at the margins, the more we begin to realize that the things that at first enticed us visually are highly problematic.
Absolutely. And I think within the broader narrative of Exodus, one of the central things, I mean, the encounter on Sinai, the revelation of the Ten Commandments on Sinai, happens at the very centre of Exodus. And the build-up to that, the dialogue between God and Moses and the people is about the people being chosen as God's treasured possession. They are to be holy. And the theme of holiness runs throughout the book of Exodus. And actually these chapters 32 to 34 come just after the very, very lengthy descriptions of the tabernacle and how that ought to be created and set up. And so we then have this awful juxtaposition with the opposite of holiness. The people had been consecrated in order to come near the mountain to receive the covenant, and yet this is the result. One of the things we haven't mentioned is actually the tents, and that's just a link to what's been happening in Exodus before this chapter, which is these descriptions of the tabernacle. But actually, strangely, when you think about it, it is also about divine presence. That the tent symbolises the tabernacle. But I think this painting leaves you wanting the next scene. You know, we want to see what happens with Moses, how Moses comes into the light and is actually then seen by the people. That they remember that Moses is there, they remember the promises that were made, and they're then able to see the full extent of the sin that this calf represents and all of this partying.
Thank you.